All right, I think we're live now.
And is this being recorded?
And yeah, it is being recorded, by the way, and I wanted to tell everyone, but I can delete the recording. It's actually recorded automatically by the platform, but I mean,
I'm okay
if
with
you
that.
wish. Oh, you're okay with that? That's great. Then we can
Yeah.
keep a record. And there are a lot of people who really wanted to join, but they couldn't because they have classes, so they can watch it afterwards. So it's great. Thank you.
No, it's
Thank you,
perfect.
Matthew.
Fine.
All right, so I think people are starting to join.
Am I able to see? Oh, I can see participants. Okay.
So participants, yeah. So there are 37 people who have registered for this. So
Okay.
I think they will start showing up. So maybe we can give it a minute or two. So Matt, you told me that you have. Do you have PowerPoint? No, you don't need to use the PowerPoint,
No.
right? Okay,
No.
great, awesome. All right, I think we can start. At least I can start with the introduction, and then people start to join. So hello, bonjour, and welcome everyone. I am Mehdi Gassemi, Director of Research at ISTC, the Lille Institute of Communication Studies, and I am very pleased to welcome you all to the 6th session of our annual seminar that we are organizing this year in partnership with Centre Internet et Société Research Group of the CNRS. It is with great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Matthew Flisfeder, who has joined us from Winnipeg, Canada. Matthew is Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Communication at the University of Winnipeg, and he's a well-known scholar, actually, in the field of what can be called New Lacanian media studies or new media studies. Among his publications are Postmodern Theory and Blade Runner that he published with Bloomsbury in 2017, The Symbolic, the Sublime, and Slavoj Žižek's Theory of Film that he published with Palgrave in 2012, and Žižek in Media Studies, a reader that he co-edited and published with Palgrave Macmillan in 2014. His most recent book, Algorithmic Desire Toward a New Structuralist Theory of Social Media, is published by Northwestern University Press, and it came out in 2021. I must say, I'm a fan of Matthew's work, and I'm particularly happy to host him because he's one of the not many, actually, media scholars who have been trying to articulate a Lacanian understanding of digital or internet-based media. And this is something that is strikingly missing in new media scholarship, given how Lacan has traditionally been really important in film and media studies. Matthew's scholarship is, I think, very helpful and important because it precisely addresses this lack and suggests very interesting ways to use Lacanian notions to understand how social media reflect and structure society, enjoyment, and fantasy. So today, Matthew will be talking to us about algorithmic desire and the big other in new times. It's a great title, Matt. That sounds very promising. We will, of course, have a Q&A session after Matthew's presentation. You see a tab dedicated to questions at the bottom right side of the screen. Feel free to post your questions there, even during the talk. I'll then try to take as many questions as time allows and relay them to Matthew after his presentation. All right, so I won't take any more time, and I hand the mic over to our speaker, Dr. Flisfeder. Je vous en prie.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour, je suis très heureux d'être ici aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup à Mehdi pour m'inviter de parler. Il fait plusieurs années, plus que 20 ans maintenant que j'ai parlé en français en public. Alors, je m'excuse, je vais parler aujourd'hui en anglais. Okay. So the talk that I'm going to give today, this is based on a response. The journal Rethinking Marxism is going to do a book symposium on my book, Algorithmic Desire, which includes 3 respondents. And then the paper I'm presenting right now is a draft of the response that I've authored in response to the discussion of the book. Okay, so I'll start. The earliest parts of my book, Algorithmic Desire Toward a New Structuralist Theory of Social Media, were written close to 10 years ago when I first began theorizing social media primarily through a Lacanian and Žižekian lens. What I believed then, and I still believe now, is that media theory operates for us as a wing in our understanding of the formal and structural contours of ideology. Since the book was written over a number of years, beginning around 2012, with the final manuscript being completed in 2019, there are certainly dimensions of the book that I know require clarification and elaboration, as well as elements of reconceptualization given the rapid pace of technological acceleration. Nevertheless, I stand behind what I believe are the central insights of the book, most notably my point outlined in the introduction, that studying the formal and structural features of the dominant medium of any particular historical period renders for us an understanding of the forms taken by the dominant ideology, as well as the dominant form of consciousness. Media are in this way historical metaphors for ideological structures, and in this way help us to map the totality of the existing system. Algorithmic Desire is thus intended as a book about ideology and its structure, which is why I focus on the metaphor of social media more so than about the political economy of social media platforms and capitalism and the immediacy or flatness of the digital. Although for some, focusing on the metaphor of social media may be perceived as an idealist gesture, in my view, as Frederick Jameson once put it, it is better to grasp Marxism and the dialectic as an attempt to overcome not idealism by itself, but the very ideological opposition between idealism and materialism in the first place. My conception of the metaphor of social media is not intended as a strategy for ignoring the materiality of the class struggle. It is rather conceived through a strategy of immanent critique to bring to the surface the real existence of material contradictions that prevent the realization of the concept of social media itself. This is why I take up social media as an ideological metaphor to also help us in our representation of the totality of 21st century capitalism. In contrast to many of the flat materialisms currently in vogue, the materialism I espouse in Algorithmic Desire is first and foremost dialectical. In writing the book, I knew that at least two of my proposals would receive some pushback, largely from Lacanians working in media studies. The 2 points that I have in mind are the following. First, that despite arguments made by Slavoj Žižek, Frederick Jameson, and Jody Dean regarding the thesis of the supposed demise of symbolic efficiency, Algorithmic desires what some might think of as an unorthodox thesis on the idea of the Lacanian big other. Specifically, I argue, and I still stand by this claim, that social media can be understood as a representation of the reconstitution of the big other for the age of 21st century capitalism. As I develop it in the book, this is where I wanted to say a little bit about algorithmic desire. As I develop it in the book, the user's desire is driven by the way social media algorithms learn practices of keeping desire for us always at a distance, learning to curate our online digital social networks in ways that ensure our constant dissatisfaction. As I put it in the book, algorithmic logic is built not by giving us what we seem to desire, but by constantly denying us this. Algorithmic desire is a strategy enabled by corporate social media platforms to ensure that we remain interpolated by constantly seeking out recognition in the forms of likes, shares, follows, retweets, comments, and so forth. But algorithmic desire works best by maintaining a moving target. The dilemma, however, and this is one, this dilemma is one that speaks to the second point of pushback that I expected to receive, is that the subject of 21st century postmodern capitalism already knows that the big other does not exist. That is, for Lacan, the process of the psychoanalytic cure is meant to lead the subject towards the realization that the big other, that is the virtual agency guaranteeing meaning, is itself alienated, incomplete, and fissured by gaps. But the apparent popular knowledge of this fact would seem to undermine its subversive edge. So how then does the big other operate on social media, as I claim, when it appears that no one believes any longer in its efficacy? My claim in the book is that the form of postmodern subjectivity is perverse in the Lacanian sense. That is, faced with the potential demise of the big other, or the demise of symbolic efficiency, the postmodern subject of 21st century capitalism seeks to reconstitute the big other as the only possible means of procuring enjoyment. As Lacan put it in Seminar 11 on the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, perversion is in a way an inverted effect of fantasy. This is a quote from Lacan. Perversion is the subject who determines himself as object for the big other in his encounter with the division of subjectivity. There is, as both Zizek and Todd McGowan, for instance, describe, there is an inherent cynicism present in this subject that overlaps with the mechanism of perversion in the form of fetishistic disavowal. The formula of je sais bien mais quand même, I know very well, but nevertheless. I know very well that the big other does not exist. Nevertheless, I act as if this were not the case. The subject knows, in other words, that the big other does not exist, but disavows this knowledge in order to maintain the structure of its enjoyment. Nevertheless, I believe that this form of cynical disavowal demonstrates yet another way that belief in the big other is maintained with regards to the other's belief in itself. Although every empirical small other person may know consciously that the big other does not exist, there always remains the ambiguity of the other's own belief. We don't know what the other does or does not know. And in order to maintain our own status, and this is particularly true of the entrepreneurial and curatorial ethics of neoliberalism, a point that I develop later on in the book, in order to maintain our own status, it becomes necessary to perform and to keep up appearances for the other. This is how ideology, I claim, functions today. It is this particularly cynical and perverse form of subjectivity that, for me, represents the material form of social media platforms, as well as more generally the form of ideology which it has taken in the context of 21st century capitalism. It is in the guise of maintaining appearances that the cynical form of neoliberal ideology persists on and through social media. As I try to develop it in the book, our ideological conundrum today consists not in the fact that we know that the matrix of the big other does not exist, that is, that the surface level of ideological propositions are indeed false. The problem is rather that we know this, but nevertheless we continue to act as if it were not the case. Why? The standard notion of ideology in much of contemporary media and communication studies, at least in my country, in Canada, in media and communication studies, the standard notion of ideology often relies on the same premise as the one developed in Herman and Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. In that book, the authors developed their propaganda model of communication, showing how content on mainstream mass media is the product of an advanced system of filtration that reproduces the dominant ideology in the interests of big capital. Herman and Chomsky seem to imply that if only the people knew the truth, if only the people became aware of the agenda-setting mechanism, that is, if only the people knew about the matrix, then they would react and revolt. However, our problem today, I claim, is that we do know about the various systems of media filtration and propaganda. This is, in fact, the very setting in which the problem of the so-called fake news and post-truth society has emerged. No one believes or trusts the media. The point is even brought to bear upon social media, since so often it is claimed that social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, TikTok now, YouTube, Instagram, and so forth, these do not, in fact, make us social. Social media, we are often told, is constantly making us antisocial. It appears as though, through the dissolution of trust in the media, that the symbolic order, in the Lacanian sense, not only of shared space of language and communication, but also our symbolic trust in dominant institutions, is dissolving, and that no one believes any longer in the virtual agency of the big other. But is this really the case? I'm going to say no, it's not the case. One of the goals of algorithmic desire is to argue that the structure and form of social media demonstrates the opposite. Despite the fact that so many of us avow our belief and distrust in the media, we continue to operate and act as if this were not the case. Social media represents, I claim, a willing back into existence of the big other of a certain variety, because it is the existence of the big other, understood as the virtual collection of all the small plural others of community, nation, society, and so forth, all of those others that we cannot account for empirically and instead substitute with the virtual agency of the assumed big other. It is the existence of this big other that enables the conditions of our enjoyment built upon the continuous metonymical operation of desire as the constant searching out for that which we believe will help us to evade our existence as lacking beings. Desire in the Lacanian sense, I argue, is therefore only enabled by the presumed, if however disavowed, existence of the big other. Our ideological condition today is then based on the belief not necessarily in the knowledge, but in the ignorance of the big other. That is, its own ignorance. Our problem consists not in believing in the existence of the big other, but in the need to maintain appearances in order to guarantee that the big other believes in itself. We may know full well that the big other does not exist, that it is merely a symbolic fiction. However, and paradoxically, we are only able to garner enjoyment insofar as it is registered by the big other, and therefore our activity is premised on maintaining appearances that will the big other back into existence. The big other's belief in itself is maintained as the very premise of our ability to garner enjoyment. Furthermore, it is this maintenance of the big other as guarantor of our enjoyment that enables corporate social media platforms to integrate us into the matrix through libidinal investments as part of its own practices of appropriating and extracting surplus value. Social media, like the matrix, is a machine for extracting jouissance, which it converts into surplus value. This, however, is also the proper situation in which we can come to grasp the ideological dimensions of contemporary neoliberal capitalism, a condition that, as I argue in my book, can be made readable through the analysis and critique of social media. These are points I draw out at length in my book, and I don't want to really rehash in their entirety here. So I admit that I part ways with the discussion of the thesis about the demise of symbolic efficiency as it's been taken up in media studies and humanities scholarship more generally. I do so because, for me, it's important not to lose sight of the fact that the claim that the big other does not exist has not and must not lose its subversive edge. The problem is not ignorance or false consciousness, but disavowal in the form or structure taken by contemporary ideology. So this is a point that I take up largely in a discussion of Jody Dean's concept of communicated capitalism. Generally, my view is that the so-called demise of symbolic efficiency is only apparent, and that the operation of ideology today still demonstrates a disavowed, non-transparent belief in the efficiency of the symbolic order or the big other, though not without the presence of conflict, antagonism, and contradiction. This is a point I make through numerous references in the form of social media, that the form social media takes in the context of the material class struggle. In fact, it's a point I make against assemblage theories of media and technology, such as the Deleuze and Guattari inspired version articulated by Maurizio Lazzarato. I believe that their conception of what they call machinic enslavement corresponds with a mechanistic and expressive causality that leaves no room for the agency of the alienated, desiring subject. So my argument that the form taken by ideology and subjectivity, both on social media and in postmodern capitalism generally, is that of perversion in the Lacanian sense. This is best encapsulated by the formula of disavowal that I've already described, the fact that the subject disavows the non-existence of the big other, and in fact aims to will it back into existence as a condition of enjoyment through the form of the desire. This point can be explained further through a brief discussion of the Netflix documentary, Jeff Orlowski's documentary, The Social Dilemma. A movie you'll see I really dislike. First and foremost is the irony of the fact that the film itself was released and distributed by Netflix, a company that relies heavily on algorithmic desire through the fact that it gathers data about users to curate content. The Social Dilemma documents the ways that social media platforms like Facebook, through techniques of data management and surveillance, collect information about users in order to better manipulate users' beliefs and activities. The documentary relies heavily on Shoshana Zuboff's writing about surveillance capitalism. Without going too deeply into the claims of the Zuboff text, my central problem with the idea of surveillance capitalism is that it appears to ignore the fact that there has never been a form of capitalism that did not rely on surveillance. Surveillance has always been a mechanism incorporated into capitalist forms of production, as well into the form of market distribution, circulation, and consumption. Capitalist production has always relied on the surveillance of the employer and managers who make sure that workers are performing and optimizing their labor in the production process. Fordist mechanization and Taylorist scientific management have historically aided in the advancement of inherent forms of productive surveillance. As well, forms of market research have always been a part of consumerism. Gathering information about consumers, their wants, their needs, their desires, is something that the consumer side of capitalism has relied on for more than a century. Surveillance, then, is nothing new in capitalism. What's different is the pace, accuracy, and automation of these mechanisms of surveillance that work to enhance the grasp that the system exerts upon the people. But here, the point I want to make is that not surveillance, but capitalism is the problem. Surveillance as such is not necessarily a problem, a point that Foucauldian paranoia about power often substitutes for the historical materialist attention to freedom and universality. Rather, what remains problematic is the way that capitalism uses surveillance to better exploit and manipulate the people. We should try to recognize that surveillance can and should be used by the people as a way to hold government and elites to account. We require the use and the operationalization of surveillance as a necessary democratic and emancipatory tool. Thus, as with the blanket critique of social media technology as inherently problematic, and as I argue in my book, the problem is not with the technology itself, but with the interest being served in its particular use. Again, as I try to develop in the book, the problem is not so much with social media technology, rather our analysis of social media platforms helps to teach us about the exploitative dimensions of neoliberalism and capitalism more generally. While several other texts currently exist that examine the political economy of social media and its mechanism of surveillance, and here I note this in my book as well, but it's worth noting that Foucauldian and Deleuzian paradigms are doxa in this field. So despite the existence of these texts, the objective of my book is in part to show how social media reflects the ideological structure of 21st century capitalism and the kinds of reflexivity and consciousness it prescribes. By stressing the problem with particular social media platforms like Facebook, of course, Netflix operates similarly, as well as with the technological capacities for surveillance and content curation, the social dilemma is limited in avoiding the aggregate situation of 21st century capitalism. Algorithmic Desire, my book, is an attempt to show that our analysis and critique of social media cannot end at our grasping of technology or the platforms. It must go further in generating a critique of the structure of neoliberalism specifically and capitalism generally. This, in part, is what I mean when I conclude the book by arguing against a version of left accelerationism, that we must not accelerate the technology, but we should accelerate the metaphor or the concept of social media. Rather than abandoning the idea of social media with an emphasis on the social, we must make use of this very concept as a tool for producing an immanent critique of the various failures and betrayals of the social in the way it is operationalized by capital. That is, by the way capital expropriates from the social. The way it does this on social media is grasped in my conception of algorithmic desire. By algorithmic desire, I am definitely not describing the desire of the algorithm, but rather with the way that social media algorithms have learned to automate and curate the representation of the big other. Algorithmic desire, in other words, is not the desire of the algorithm, but our own, which is also the presumed desire of the big others. Of the big other, networks of other users. As Lacan says, the desire is always the desire of the other. Yet for me, the other implied by the user's desire in social media is not the algorithm, but the social network of friends and followers. As I say quite directly in my book, the network takes on the form or the structure of the Lacanian big other, the symbolic order, operating as a lure of sorts for the user's desire. The social media big other is not the algorithm, but the production of the social, the community of others with whom we are engaged. That is what social media scholar Alice Marwick refers to as social surveillance, as opposed to the kinds of corporate surveillance alluded to in the idea of surveillance capitalism. What I describe, though, is the way that platform analytics learn the algorithm of our desire. Social surveillance refers to the field of social media friends and followers we try to impress with our posts. So-called, I hate the term, but so-called virtue signaling, although the activity I have in mind is not simply limited to this, provides a useful example. Virtue signaling is the act of posting content that makes the user appear virtuous from the perspective of their social media friends and followers. It matters little if the user truly believes in the ideas or content they are posting, making things all the more cynical. What matters is that it satisfies the interests and desires of other users. So much of social media is premised on the project of managing one's online digital reputation. Users curate content aimed at an audience of other users to produce and develop their reputation. This is not necessarily something that one needs to engage in directly or actively. However, the conditions of the neoliberalization of the economy make our social interactions with others all the more utilitarian and instrumental. And this is a practice that inherently translates onto social media platforms. Even the character of the troll, the social media troll, works in this way, since their practice of reputation management is premised on the idea of tarnishing the reputation of others, an act for which trolls aim to satisfy the desire of their own friends and followers. All of these examples help to show that the desire that users are engaged in satisfying in social media is the desire of the big other in the form of a social network or social surveillance of other users. Algorithmic desire thus concerns the way that social media algorithms learn to curate our particular view of the social media big other as the particular community of other users whom we see and engage with on the platform. Social media algorithms learn to read our desire by constantly keeping it at a distance from us. Algorithms learn to keep us libidinally engaged by forever maintaining our dissatisfaction. We only ever desire insofar as our desire remains unsatiated. It is through this libidinal investment that the matrix of social media platforms continuously recruits us as it extracts surplus value from our labor. That is not necessarily in the form of what someone like Christian Fuchs refers to as the prosumer commodity, but even in the way that the general form of social production in 21st century capitalism operationalizes our, in quotes, entrepreneurial investments into our human capital, where acts of consumption are conceived as productive acts of investing in the self. These are not voluntary practices, but ones conditioned by the austerity-driven structure of precarious life under neoliberalism. But if we know this, if we know that this is how things operate, why then do we continue to disavow this knowledge? So if we know that we're being exploited in this way, if we know that we're being encouraged to participate in this way, if we know all this, then why do we continue to act as if it's not the case? So part of the reason why Zizek, Dean, Jameson, and others claim that our present is defined by a demise of symbolic efficiency, or I prefer better the way that Fred Jameson puts it in his early postmodernism writing as a breakdown of the signifying chain. As they claim that the reason is due to the fact that symbolic appears to be fissured by conflict, antagonism, and struggle. Even today, as I've already noted, our world is plagued by the problem of fake news, disintegration of trust in symbolic institutions like the media, and the emergence of the post-truth era. There are, again, 2 points worth noting here. First is the fact that, and this is a point I try to articulate regarding my conception in the book, what I call a new structuralism. So first is the fact that the symbolic order is never a complete whole. It is non-all, organized or structured around an inherent lack, gap, or void. Second, not unlike the operation of commodity fetishism, our belief in the big other and the efficiency of the symbolic order is demonstrated not by what we directly know or believe, but by the ways in which we are effectively acting and participating in the material operations of capitalist society. Despite an apparent distrust in symbolic institutions, many of us nevertheless continue participating in them, and even the very basic matrix of commodity fetishism demonstrates where and how this remains universal, even if not everyone participates in the same specific or particular institutions, such as corporate social media platforms. After all, We all seem to know about the existence of platform capitalism. Nevertheless, many of us who know continue to participate in this very matrix. The materiality of social media is in this way correlates with the form of commodity fetishism. The fact that antagonism persists, that different users are interpolated differently, does not mean that we all know that the big other does not exist or that there has been a demise of symbolic efficiency. Rather, it demonstrates the fact that the symbolic order is not all, and that the lack of the social is a material articulation of the class struggle as real. Despite the presence of antagonism, it is by way of the common reference to the materiality of the platform that its abstractions, not unlike commodity fetishism, are shown to have a hold upon us in one way or another. Commodity fetishism and the universality of the commodity form under capitalism provides the elementary or basic underlying premise upon which all other operations in capitalist production, circulation, and consumption operate. While we might point to money as a material object, whether as paper bills, banknotes, coins, even digital currency, cryptocurrency maybe, and avow the fact that this is merely a material object, a piece of paper, bits of information on a digital ledger, in our actions, in our practices. Whenever we exchange the money commodity for goods or services, we demonstrate our belief in objective form. We may, of course, still do this, knowing full well that there is no intrinsic value in money, but our acts of monetary exchange show that its value is contained in the social relationship that it represents. Money only ever works if those with whom we are engaged in acts of exchange accept the value embodied in the money commodity. That is, it only ever works if we share the same basic premise that the value of the commodity is guaranteed by the virtual agency of the big other, who we must assume believes in the value of the money commodity on our behalf. Similarly, on social media, the material infrastructure of the internet, algorithms as fixed capital, and the general capitalist political economy interpolates us to participate through the lure of desire and the reproduction of lack constitutive of subjectivity. Just looking at the time. Okay.
You're still good, Matt. You still have 10 more minutes, 10, 15 more minutes.
Okay, I'm going to skip over. I have a huge chunk here that it'll be available in the final article where I kind of take to task the way that Althusser has been taken up in media studies and the way that the Slovenian schools critique of Althusser has to be reintegrated into material. I'm going to skip over this. If there's questions later on, maybe I can respond, but I think it'll just gobble up too much time. Okay, so a few more comments I think are necessary to draw out further consequences from the argument regarding the so-called demise of symbolic efficiency. As I've already indicated, the thesis regarding the so-called demise of symbolic efficiency is one that Zizek explains near the end of his book, Ticklish Subject. It's a thesis that Jodi Dean relies upon for her conception of communicative capitalism, and to argue that ideology becomes a function of drive as opposed to desire when it appears no one believes any longer in the existence of the big other. It's worth reminding ourselves that in the Lacanian paradigm, recognition of the non-existence of the big other overlaps with the moment of the psychoanalytic cure. This is one reason why I argue against Dean that the demise of symbolic efficiency is only apparent, and that we must come to grasp the dominant form of subjectivity in conditions of postmodern 21st century capitalism according to the logic of perversion and fetishism disavowal. So here I still rely on Zizek's very early thesis regarding the cynical form of ideology. The thesis about the demise of symbolic efficiency should also be read, I claim, in terms of Frederick Jameson's conception of postmodernism, which he describes in Lacanian terms, as I've said, as a breakdown of the signifying chain. As I read Jameson here, our postmodern dilemma is grounded in the fact that on both the left and the right, every affirmative articulation of explanatory narratives have been deconstructed to the point of appearing to lose their interpretive clout. The postmodern incredulity of meta-narratives, the Lyotard statement about postmodernism, the postmodern incredulity towards meta-narratives, for instance, resonates with the notion that no unifying ideological formation exists that structures us into a shared sense of identity, community, culture, nationality, class, and so forth. What Jameson calls cognitive mapping, which elsewhere he claims is merely another way to grasp the form of class consciousness, represents for him what in Lacanian terms we might regard as the force of the interpretive work and the work of narrative construction, of tying together loose threads, as the subtitle of his famous book, Narrative as a Socially Symbolic Act, to have an effect in the real. At the conclusion of his essay on postmodernism, Jameson notes that Althusser's thesis that ideology represents an imaginary relation of the subject to its real conditions of existence combines the two levels of the imaginary and the real, ignoring the level of the symbolic. Drawing from Althusser, film and media theory as well, I claim, has relied on the proposal that ideology represents a strictly imaginary relation of the subject to its real conditions of existence, likewise ignoring the dimension of the symbolic. And the section that I skipped over, I go into some detail about the way that the turn to the symbolic and the real in Zizek's work and Dolar and Zupancic, for instance, and their critique of Althusser. This is something I think has been completely ignored in the bulk of media and humanities scholarship, at least in the English-speaking world. So there are two ways that I want to return the symbolic to its proper place through my own reading interpretation of the form and structure of social media, which I've tried to develop implicitly in my book. The symbolic order, the form of the big other, I claim, is the necessary layer of ideology, that the imaginary is not in the representation directly, but is what relates the subject at a subterranean level, at the level of fantasy, or through what Zizek calls the sublime object of ideology. Representation, what we see directly in language and communication on the screen, appears at the level of the symbolic. And again, I just want to emphasize, and I'm stressing this because there's a lot of the writing on this idea in Jody Dean and in others talk about what we see on the screen as the imaginary reflection of the ideal ego, right? Very much, even in the way that early film studies in Laura Mulvey, for instance, when we see on the screen is an imaginary representation. And the claim that I'm trying to make here is that what we're seeing, representation, is still at the level of the symbolic. So the imaginary, however, relates more so to the dimension of the fantasy, tying the subject to the surface level of ideological propositions. Symbolic, then, on the one hand, pertains to two aspects of social media communications in terms of our social network itself: the social network of friends, followers, as well as the lurkers, the people who don't really post, but they're there, which is represented on platforms. And on the other hand, in the form of the curation of our identities, ourselves on the platform, in terms of how the signifier of our profile pages comes to represent for us all of the other users in the network, i.e. the big other. It is the signifier which, according to Lacan, represents the subject for all the other signifiers. The signifier is also that for which all of the others represent the subject. So I'm thinking very much about the way that we articulate and curate our social media profiles on the platform as a symbolic representation in the form of signification, the articulation of a signifier, as opposed to an imaginary representation in the Lacanian sense. So there's a second dimension of the symbolic worth highlighting with regards to Jameson's reading of the Althusserian formula from a Lacanian lens: the role the symbolic plays at the level of the interpretive analytical discourse. That is, how the symbolic bears an impact in the real. It is at this level that, on the one hand, I claim the metaphor of social media, as I described it in the introduction of my book, is both the marker of the symbolic entry into the real, as well as the very concept that we must hold on to and maintain as a tool of immanent criticism, relating to the exploitative aspects of communicative capitalism. The big other only starts to dissolve once we recognize the fact that it is also alienated and inconsistent with itself. This is what the concept of social media provides for us in the dimensions of the immanent critique. It allows us to perceive the self-relating negativity of the concept, to show that it is incapable of producing the promised digital online public sphere. What is negative in the concept is therefore what is also negative in the structure of the big other of the symbolic order. My goal in the book is to argue not for a better social media, but to use the concept of social media to grasp the material barriers to its realization as a way to go further in understanding the antagonisms and contradictions present within the structure of neoliberal capitalism. What's even more difficult to explain is the fact that by recognizing itself in the hail of an other it knows not to exist, In the performative gesture of maintaining appearances, the subject helps to reconstitute the very big other it disavows. So it's my claim that by sticking to the social media metaphor, to the concept of social media, we can continue to follow the Lacanian ethical injunction to not give way with regard to our desire. It is this ethic that I claim hystericizes the subject, and again, as Zizek and others will claim, the hysteric is the proletariat for Freud. Right? It is this ethic of not giving way with regards to one's desire that hystericizes the subject, especially if we understand hysteria as failed interpolation in the form of the hysterical question to the big other, why am I what you are saying that I am, K-boy? By following and maintaining the social media metaphor, we are made capable not merely of articulating an imminent criticism of social media, of the antisocial aspects of antagonism, Twitter wars, trolling, fake news, post-truth, the exploitative dimension of communicative capitalism. My analysis of social media is not meant merely to critique the form and structure of platforms and platform capitalism. My goal is not merely a media studies intervention into psychoanalytic theory even. It is also one of making a media studies intervention into emancipatory ethics and the critique of ideology. As well, through the prism of, and I haven't articulated here, but I can if I'm pressed, through the prism of what I call a new structuralism that I introduce, and through the analysis of algorithmic desire in social media, my claim is that we can come to grasp the form of the general ideology of 21st century neoliberal capitalism, a form which I argue is perverse. So my point is not that another social media is possible, but that through the concept or the metaphor of social media, we remain capable of seeing the constitutive dimensions of alienation and the lure of wholeness propelled by the algorithm of our desire. My claim is not that another social media is possible, not an imagined community 2.0, but that social media is only truly possible in the material conditions of universal emancipation. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. That was thank you for an extremely rich presentation. That you said a lot of things, and this is great stuff. Yeah, thank you. I have a lot of questions. Maybe I can start with a couple of questions, and this will allow people to post their questions. As I said, the audience, fortunately, the platform does not allow the members of the audience to come up and ask their questions in person, but nonetheless, they can post their questions, and I'll make sure to make them read by, I'll read them basically to Matthew. So Matthew, thanks again. So basically, if I've understood correctly, you're using the symbolic and Lacanian notions in general, but the symbolic specifically, you're bringing back the symbolic to media studies, and you're looking at social media as a form of symbolic. Is that right? So social media would be a network, would be operating like a network, like the symbolic, as Lacan proposed it, and the algorithm is basically propping up the big other that people disavow in a postmodern culture. Is this how you're theorizing it?
More or less. I mean, one of the things that I try to do, there's a chapter in the book where I'm relying on Stuart Hall's encoding decoding model of traditional television communication. And one of the things that I argue is that in the context of algorithmic media, like social media platforms, there's an added layer to the encoding decoding model where the algorithm is learning what are the best ways to keep us engaged in the platform. What kind of content does it require curating to us so that we continue to look, to browse, to comment, like, follow, retweet, share, and so on. And what I'm arguing it does is it's curating the network of the people that we see. I saw the other day somebody posted on my Twitter feed, and these are all, all of our feeds are personalized, of course, but on my feed, somebody posted, I know that a lot of you out there, I follow a lot of you out there, but I only see the same 10, 15 people all the time. And part of the argument I'm trying to make is that one of the things that the algorithm is learning to do is to curate a certain representation of the people we believe might be our audience, for lack of a better word. And this is part of how we are engaged. So what it's doing, I'm arguing, is curating the form of what we perceive as the big other as a strategy for interpolating us at the level of our desire.
So would it be correct to say that the same way that the symbolic has some kind of a grammar that undergirds it, social media also has a grammar, and that grammar is the algorithm? Would that be?
I mean, I haven't thought about it in that way, and I like that way of articulating it. I think that it's interesting. I think that one way to understand what I'm calling algorithmic desire is also just to think about the way that and this is something that Lacan kind of articulated in several places in the Écrit, the way that even with his mathemes, right, the way that we can think about our desire itself as somewhat algorithmic, right? That there's an algorithm to our desire, and that part of that algorithm includes the way in which we encounter the form of the big other in a certain way. So what I'm saying about digital media or algorithmic media is that part of that structure involves the automated way that the platform learns to curate the form of the symbolic, not even just in terms of communication, grammar, but even at the level of representation, because I think that there's something about the way in which, language as a form of representation is curated to us in terms of, how we articulate ourselves, the send out the message to the other and return it back in inverted form, in the form of our engagement with the platform. So I see the symbolic on social media somewhat in this way. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. And I love how you bring back basically the discussion of the symbolic to understanding new media, and it's a crucial Lacanian point that a signifier, it's not always a word. An image can definitely work as a signifier. In this case, our social media profiles are signifiers that are connected to one another, just like signifiers in the symbolic order.
Yeah, exactly.
It makes sense.
That's very much the way that I'm thinking about it. I mean, one of the ways I tend to think about the signifier as hook is in that moment of the kind of reversal of the moment of the development of the ego and the imaginary, of the ideal ego, the moment of switch when it's articulated for the ideal ego in the imaginary, and then the moment when it's reversed into the ego ideal in symbolic, in terms of the way that we desire the desire of the mother, or even articulated in reaction to the father, the father function, in a certain way. So that in the moment of subjectivization, part of what we're doing is articulating or grasping a sense of self, but in imaginary, the stupid, mirror phase type of thing. But it's the reversal then into when we are articulated in the form of the signifier that cuts through us. That is not just what represents us for other signifiers, but the way in which all of the others, right? Because subject occupying that position of lack or gap within the symbolic, right? The way in which all of the others already present articulate the subject in that way, right? Part of what I try to do, and I didn't get into it, is in this idea of new structuralism, which I admit is kind of an experiment in the way that I'm naming it here, but I'm drawing a bit on what Bruno Bostiels, for instance, talking about Leclau and Mouffe and Zizek and Dollard, talks about this new idea, moving away from Althusser, this idea of structural causality that includes a gap in the structure. That what's important for Leclau and Mouffe in their conception of antagonism, and then Zizek and Dollard and Zupancic and others, I'm in the Slovenian school, is the way that the structure is always articulated around a gap or a lack, which is the position from which the subject speaks.
Exactly.
Right? So it's in that moment of articulation, and here I'm talking in social media, in terms of social media, in the way in which we articulate ourselves in the curation of our profile, that that we're tying ourselves to that form of signification for which we're presenting to the others, but for which all the others represent us.
Yeah, and when you look at social media as a symbolic, then by definition, your Zizekian reading of it is ontologically complete, so there is a gap, and that gap leaves the space for the subject, for the universal subject, basically, to be articulated in this.
Right.
Yeah, it's a great reading. I love it. I have so many other questions, but I see questions are coming in from the audience. Oliver, my colleague here at ISTC, Oliver Kenny, asks you, so he says, thank you for your talk. You talk very generally about media companies, social media, and algorithm. Could you give clear examples of these to explain your point in greater detail?
Sorry, examples of
So examples of when you say we. Do you see his question? If you go to question,
under questions.
So if you go questions,
originally we companies, social media. Could you give a clear example of these? I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. Examples of the we or of media companies.
Yeah. I think when he says when you say we, basically, what do you mean by that? Or
like who is the we? I mean,
I suppose
it's a difficult question. I mean, I don't like to shy away from this idea of the articulation of the we. I mean, when I say we, I mean all of us who are on the side of freedom, emancipation, equity, against exploitation. I mean, I like to articulate joined we in the sense of collaboration against the forces of oppression, exploitation, domination, and so forth. I think that we don't say we enough. I think that there's too much I and me, especially in the way that the neoliberal form of entrepreneurialism, liberal individualism even, and in many forms of social justice activity. I think that there's too often this particularization of cordoned off individualization. I think that we have to articulate a we very much against when we say media institutions. So we're talking about media institutions that are dominant in the articulation of information, news, current events, mainstream mass media, cable news, the press. But again, even news aggregators like platforms like Facebook and Twitter, right? I mean, these are major corporations that bear a huge responsibility for the way in which information is organized and disseminated and curated to us. And this is not to say that I think that the stupid Trump fake news argument carries weight. I think that the left has provided a much deeper structural organizational analysis in the political economic critique of the media to show what is the actual bias that we find in the media. In fact, I don't even like talking about, I think it's an easy criticism to just say that the media is biased. I think that we have to, against domination, have to talk about not is or is not the media biased, but towards whose or towards which interests is the media biased, right? I think that question actually tells us so much more than just the simple argument that media are biased. And when we look at social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, the bias implied very much comes down to the bottom line. I mean, it's difficult to say that Facebook has a particular avowed ideological predisposition in terms of the old political left-right spectrum. What it's invested in is its bottom line. What it's invested in is making sure that the company is profitable, and in that way, its ideological predisposition is very much one towards capital, right? So that's kind of who I mean when I'm talking here. And I'll just say one thing quickly. That again, going back to the way that I'm using the Stewart Hall encoding decoding model. Remember, if you're familiar with it in the model, both the encoding and the decoding side, talks about frameworks of knowledge, the technological infrastructure, and our relative position, which within the social relations of production. And on the encoding side, in the age of television, we're talking about a very costly production. So we're talking about very wealthy entities, corporations, very wealthy individuals who have a leg up in the way in which content can be constructed, tying that into what he calls frameworks of knowledge. So the particular ideological perspective of the people producing content, right? It's important to the worldview that gets articulated in the media content. But what you have to add in to that model is that dimension of feedback, so that on the decoding side, on the side of the audience, that the goal is still to maintain an audience, and you want to ensure that you don't lose your audience because of ideological differences. So there's a need at the level of reproduction, right? At the feedback level on the encoding side, to make sure that you're tying in content that the audience can find somewhat satisfactory or can be interpolated in some way. So part of what I'm arguing with algorithmic desire is that the media companies we're talking about, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Google, I mean, they're all owned now, right, by the same people, but that mechanism is enhancing the pace at which the feedback loop of the decoding, right, the output side, can be re-encoded back on the input side to maintain an audience, to maintain the attention of the audience. And in this way, I think we can understand the form that ideological interpolation takes in the context of digital new media. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, it is clear.
But
no, it is clear. And just to complement what you said about the we and the necessity of using the we, and I think it's brilliant, because in your book you demonstrate how social media as it is done by postmodern capitalism, the way it is, by surveillance capitalism, if you want to use Zuboff, it's a failed sociality. And if we insist on the we, then perhaps this is one way to address that failed sociality brought about by social media as they are. Great. So Oliver has another question. So he says, you mentioned the social dilemma, and it is noticeable in your book that your examples are often cinematic. For example, the King's Speech in your introduction. Could you explain why you found these to be the most appropriate examples of algorithmic desire rather than, say, PageRank or other specific algorithms?
So it's a good question. So Oliver just asked a question. I see that there's another question. I want to respond to Oliver's question because I think it's a good question. But maybe we can get to Thomas. I see has a question, and then I can come back to Oliver. I'm happy to.
Yeah. So Thomas, thank you for your intervention. You touched on Netflix as a platform that uses the same system as a social media platform. Could you elaborate a bit on streaming platforms in opposition to social media? One being for watching, passive, and the other for interactive or active?
That's a really good question. I think that the simple answer for me is that I do think that streaming platforms are interactive in the same way that I think Amazon, for instance, and other online retailers are interactive. When you're using Netflix, I mean, you're interacting, very much when you're choosing and selecting the programs that you watch. I mean, we have to remember that these are forms of interaction on algorithmic new media, right? When you go onto Amazon, every time you go onto Amazon, it knows right away what you want to, what you're looking to buy, right? Every time I click on Amazon, it's like showing me, right now, because of what I'm researching, it's this is the new text that's talking about Sartre, or this is the new translation of Hegel, and I'm like, oh my god, I have to immediately get, right? I think that the Amazon recommendation software is a little bit better than the Netflix recommendation software, or maybe it's just that my kids have been watching too many programs on my profile, because now I keep getting all the Pokemon recommendations from my son and all the Taylor Swift documentaries, and I also think, whatever, I'm not going to speak to the quality of the content being produced on that platform, but I hope you see what I mean here, that when we're selecting the programs that we want to watch on a streaming platform, we are interacting with it, right? We have to think of interactivity in a way that's, not necessarily direct interaction with other people. We're interacting with the platform. We're interacting, and it's very much in this way that we're still interacting with the social media big other, I claim, right? We're interacting with the other and the collection, the aggregation, and then the re-curation back. I don't know if that makes sense, but curating back to us in inverted form our desire, right? There are many people who are using social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter who are not actively sharing, posting, liking, commenting, but are still interacting with the platform in the way that we scroll, right? In what we click on to read, right? I mean, who doesn't open up, you open up the Google platform on your mobile phone, or at least I do. And it's, immediately the news items that it's giving, are directly related to the search history that I've engaged in for however long I've been tied in, right? So I think that we have to think about interactivity in this way, apart from the typical way of thinking interactivity as just direct engagement with other users.
Great. Thank you.
I can go back to Oliver's question.
Sure.
Maybe. Okay, so I use the cinema examples. Why don't I use... Well, one of the examples I think I do, not as much in detail. I'll say this quickly, and then I'll go back to the film examples, why I like using them. I think it's the last chapter before the conclusion, I'm talking about the Tinder algorithm. And I use the Tinder algorithm actually as a way to think about the binary logic of programming in terms of the 1 and the 0. Right? I think about the binary logic here. I even tie it into the branching symbol from the series Black Mirror to think about the way how every time we make a choice, every time we make a selection, right? Swipe left or swipe right. It's at the same time an act of affirmation and negation, and that the way in which the back end of the platform, the way that the back end of the platform relates to the front end, insofar as it gives us a sense of, and this is also how I think about this idea of new structuralism, that when Derrida, for instance, tries to deconstruct the binary operation in the structure, right? That I think that we have to rethink the way we're understanding binary organization, not the opposition between two affirmative terms, but as the relationship between every choice we make, every decision we make is both the affirmation of a choice and the negation of all the other possible choices that were available to us. So I allegorize the algorithm, I think, a little bit in this way, but it also, in a way, that I think connects back to the initial moments of subjectivization, and even in the formation of the objet pétillant, the object cause of desire, or the idea of the lost object. Because in the moment of subjectivization, we're involved in this moment of making a choice, right? What do we choose as the object that identifies us to the gaze of the big other? And in the affirmation of that choice, we are negating all the various other options that we might have. And in the negation of all those various other options, they emerge as lost imaginary objects that become the object cause of our desire, that we then displace onto the figure of the other as in some ways being the cause for the reason why we can't get all of those various other things. And this is why we when we think about desire, it's in that pursuit of the thing that we always think that we want, but we don't realize that our actual enjoyment comes from resetting the coordinates of our initial choice, of the limit that we imposed upon ourselves. This is me, right? This is why the form of the drive develops as the resetting, the circling around the object, that I get enjoyment from never actually getting the enjoyment. I only enjoy it insofar as it remains lost. And it's in the drive that I keep getting that enjoyment. So I think, I'll just sum up that chapter. I think I use the form of the algorithm allegorically or metaphorically, I don't know, as a way to try to think about the shape and form of our desire. But one of the reasons I like to use pop culture examples like The King's Speech, Gone Girl is another, is because I think that they're very useful and relatable in the way that we can understand not just the form of the platform, but they show us the way in which social media platforms in other contexts are very much tied to the general form of ideology in 21st century capitalism. The reason I use The King's Speech is I think that it offers a very useful example for understanding how, and I kind of take this point from the media theorist Lev Manovich, where he talks about how one way to understand new media is to think the history of new media retroactively. So what does the new medium retroactively teach us about all the older media that preceded, right? So for instance, if we think about new media, and this is Manovich, if we think about new media as the connection of an interface and a database, right? So database and then the interface that makes it legible, we can think about older media, even ancient media, the stone tablet, as itself an interface connected to a database, where the database is directly its own interface. So in the same way, in talking about social media and algorithmic desire, I think we can think about older media, TV and radio, and in The King's Speech, right? I love the way that it's talking about how the way that communication and even ideological articulations have to change and transform depending on the dominant medium that is in existence. And learning to use the dominant medium doesn't mean coming across in absolute clarity, right? it means knowing how the medium relates to the desire, the algorithmic desire, I'm calling it, of the audience. So there's that moment at the end of the film where he gives the speech, but he has like a little bit of a lisp, and with the guy Lionel, he says, you messed up a bit. He said they wouldn't believe it was really me if I didn't have like some accidents. And I think that isn't that the best way to understand something like what somebody like Donald Trump was doing with Twitter. Liberals, here and there, all over the place, would make fun of how inarticulate he seemed to be on Twitter, but his fans or his followers loved it. They love it that he's using it in a very the whole Kofif, whatever it was, situation. I really think that whether he knows it or not, okay, I don't know how smart he is in what he's doing, but whether he knows it or not, articulating himself in that way was in some ways, and I want to be careful how I put this, it was appropriate for the medium. I don't find anything he says appropriate, but it coincided with the way in which the medium can be used to interpolate the audience, right? So I think that examples like the King's Speech, even Gone Girl, the way that she knew how to curate her own identity for the media, right? And she made in Gone Girl, in the film, the book it's been more, but the film itself I've watched several times. She knew the best way to make change was not by directly articulating a truth, but by presenting to the appearance of the gaze of the media, right? At the level of the symbolic, she was able to effect a change, right? So I like these examples because they coincide with social media. They coincide with different ways to understand both the form and structure of ideology, but also the way in which rhetoric matters, the way in which words and language and the symbolic matter in affecting a change in the real.
Great. Thank you. I know we're past 7 o'clock now, and we had promised to stop at 7. Can I ask you one final question myself before I'll let you go? So I had so many, but then probably we'll have another chance to go over them.
And I hope that I'm clear.
You are clear. And then thank you for that. So I'd like to. You talked about surveillance at some point in your talk, and you addressed Shoshana Zuboff's surveillance capitalism. And I'd like us to go back perhaps to surveillance. Nonetheless, it is a seminar around surveillance studies. And what I want to ask you is a question that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I've been trying to address it myself. How do you think your notions, for example, of algorithmic desire and this Lacanian articulation of basically of the problematics at the heart of social media and platform societies today, how can they nuance the discourse around surveillance the way that they're articulated by the likes of Shoshana Zuboff and so on? Because, as you know, there is this domain which is surveillance studies, and surveillance becomes the objective study, and everybody's talking about surveillance and so on. And as you rightly point out, the problem is maybe not surveillance, but the logic of capitalism that underlies it. And then when you focus too much on surveillance, then you become blind to what's behind. And so how would we use Lacan basically and Zizek and what you call the new Lacanians to nuance the discourse of surveillance studies? You don't have to answer this, but it's a question that
it's a really important question. It's definitely one that I think about quite a bit. I don't know if I have other than what I've already said about the forms of social surveillance and the big other, I don't know if I have a specifically Lacanian answer for that, but I definitely have, I guess what I would call a kind of a Marxist or a way of responding. And I think I've already said, I'm just trying to think about the way that I want to say this, because I like your question and I get your question. I guess for me, largely the problem, and I think that this is the way that we understand power by and large, I think, in a lot of academic circles, but also activist and left-wing circles. And I'm not even too sure if, I prefer to think much of my work today is based around the idea of a universal humanism, and the idea, which is very anti-Lacanian, and the idea of rethinking the form and the structure of socialism. And I guess I rely really on some things that someone like Anna Kornblue has said that so much of our understanding of power today is based on this kind of a destituent ethic, where so much of the sense of power is that we have to destroy power, we have to break it down, we have to tear it apart, we have to destroy structures, when in fact, I think that the best way to understand and articulate a material conception of freedom is through not the destruction of structure, but of the building of new structures. I think that the way in which we can deal with power today is not by destroying hierarchies or the vertical or eliminating the institutional infrastructures, but by building new structures, new forms, new infrastructures that are actually much more universal and materially equitable. And I think that in part, again, as I already said, I think that the problem is not surveillance. I think that the problem is the interests that are implied when we're talking about surveillance, who is doing the surveillance. But again, I don't think that it's possible to turn the cameras around, so to speak, until we've built already structures and forms of equitable and democratic governance in our existing institutions that can change and transform things. So just as my point about social media is not that we can change things by changing social media, I think that we have to change the form and the interest implied in the form of the society, which involves a change in the form of the law. For instance, I think everything flows down from the legal dimension. That if we change around private property, for instance, right? That if we change and re-articulate the way we understand the interests, the bias, implied in the form of society, that it's not about getting rid of the structures of surveillance, but a matter of who we are, who is under the gaze of surveillance. Now, one thing that I do want to say is that I don't think that the technology, when we talk about surveillance, I think we're always just imagining, when we walk around with our gizmos and gadgets and our Fitbits and our phones and all of these things, that it's just, all the data that's being collected about us to manipulate us. But we tend to ignore the emancipatory dimensions of the way that kind of technology can help us out. So I'll speak from personal experience. From my own life, I'm very interested as a diabetic, as a type 1 diabetic. I'm very interested in the prospect of technologies like the artificial pancreas. So I wear, for instance, a constant glucose monitor on my arm that I use my cell phone to check, and I check with my cell phone. And some people wear insulin pumps, and there's development of technology to connect the constant glucose monitor with the insulin pump through cloud technology, so that it's gathering the data and it's automatically deciding, whether to give insulin or glucagon if your blood sugar is too low. And, there's the cyborg dimension of it, which I don't want to get into too much detail, because I actually don't think it's a cyborg at all. I think that this is very humanizing in the way that it works. But it can be by some regarded as the surveillance of our medical data, right? But I actually think that there is much liberating potential to it if we change not the mechanisms of surveillance, but the mechanisms of governance. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And would you agree that much of the discourse today about surveillance and focusing on surveillance as the problem, maybe it is, it's an example of what you call the logic of perversion that's underlying, because we don't live in a society where we don't believe really in the big other. We vicariously believe in the big other as a surveillant, malevolent thing that's looking at us, and so on and so forth. And then when you focus too much, just like the Lacanian perverse, you don't change anything, because you focus on the foot, which is here surveillance, and then you let the other at it is.
No, I agree with you. I think that's a very good way of putting it. And it's a way of disavowing even, the real sites of power and exploitation and domination. But, it's interesting the way in which I see the dominant discourse of surveillance being articulated is very much in concert with liberal notions of privacy, right? Bourgeois notions of privacy. And I think that they go hand in hand with each other. And right now, the problem is that even in the way that our data is collected and mined by platforms, is that we are out in public and it's our data that's being privatized, right? It's the privatization of our data, while corporate platforms and so on, they have the real kind of privacy, that we all say that we want. So I think that any critical discussion of surveillance today has to take into consideration the form of privacy and publicity that we're talking about here, right? That I think that we should be able to have a society where we can be surveilled in public, right? We have to think about the way in which our public persona is being not surveilled but privatized, right? It's the way in which we, the aspects are privatized and commodified and monetized by forces that are outside of ourselves. I hope that makes sense.
It does. It's great talking to you, Matthew. And at some point, we need to bring this to an end. I hope we have another chance sometime to go over this. Maybe, as I said before we started the seminar, maybe we can organize a conference at some point about locale and new media.
I absolutely loved it. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I really appreciate the questions, both from you and the interlocutors on there. I'm very, very happy to be here today.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the audience. Thank you, Oliver and Thomas, for the questions. Thanks again, Matthew. So until next time, hopefully, à très bientôt.
Oui. Merci beaucoup.